My talk today is in the vicinity of public philosophy. So last year I spent a great deal of time thinking about the meaning of public philosophy. What does it mean to practice philosophy publicly? And in what sense we should think that it's something important. So I'm not going to have time to get into a very full answer of that, but I am going to try to sketch an answer. And I'm going to try to talk about the precondition for public philosophy, which is what I mean by the spiritualization of philosophy. Okay. So I'm going to start with a different question rather than this public philosophy, which is going to frame the talk, which is how do we understand the meaning of struggle philosophy or philosophy of struggle, I'm going to use those interchangeably, as like an event or an emergence, maybe even as a philosophical term, right? The simplest answer to this question is historical, like philosophy of struggle. Okay, we get new philosophical traditions, much like Marxism, phenomenology, or some other philosophical school. And in this sense, there have been, of course, a plethora of emergences, and picking out the meaning of this particular one would just be isolating these historical processes that produced philosophy born of struggle in the light of existing institutions. But I think that this reading of struggle philosophy emphasizes a continuity with philosophy writ large, which may not be warranted. Philosophy born of struggle, if we were to attempt to pin it down as a single tradition or a set of traditions, is not individuated according to its novel philosophical techniques, nor through its fidelity to a specific author or text. It does not advocate for any special mode of reasoning, and despite its insistence that philosophy is a walkway, it is unclear as to whether struggle philosophy constitutes a way of life unto itself. So perhaps counterintuitively, given its nominal trappings, it is not another rendering of first philosophy. It does not claim that philosophy ought to begin by paying tribute to some special ethical, epistemic, or theological foundation. Nor does its emergence coincide with a redescription of philosophy that would explain what philosophers have been up to this whole time, or why they haven't been able to do it. And indeed, what I wish to emphasize as interesting in philosophy born of struggle, with respect to its character and its emergence, is that it is not a transformation of philosophy from within, so much as a rejection of philosophy from without. It begins in reproach of some of philosophy's most prestigious traditions and techniques. It reproaches the high-flying abstractions, gross pretensions to universal reason, and categorically impossible beings of many traditions. And what's important here is that this reproach of philosophy takes place from the vantage of non-philosophy. It is precisely this priority of the non-philosophical that explains why philosophy born of struggle is an example of the spiritualization of philosophy, one which generates collective styles of public philosophy. So I'll spend the rest of the talk just unpacking that sentence. So I'm using the word priority, like the priority of the non-philosophical, in part because Harris's rejection of the monstrosity of certain concepts, for example, the soul or the being of being, is a rejection of the way that philosophy itself has in various ways prioritized impossible beings or abstractions over the facts of immiseration and oppression. So suffering tends to be neatly tucked away behind the all-important pursuit of universal laws and best explanations. So, quote, "Too often, the conceptual world of philosophy has been a place where murder, rape, and pillage are accidental or fleeting events in a larger scenario where evolution or some other system portends well-being for all. Misery is nestled and hidden behind some purposeful condition that assures progress and future well-being." So the problem here is that philosophy, by way of its own self-portrait, either its practice or of the thinker that's capable of its practice, it grants itself its own goals and instruction manuals that stake out a philosophical agenda which does not include the oppressed and the damned. And in this sense, I want to suggest that struggle philosophy does not, in fact, pit non-philosophy as such against philosophy as such, by rejecting the latter's loftier pursuits. What's going on is rather a rejection of philosophy's relation to non-philosophy from the strategizing vantage of non-philosophy. So that what's at stake here is the way that philosophy encounters non-philosophy in each case. So whatever priorities emerge in philosophy, whether we're talking Plato, Heidegger, Deleuze, or Harris, they're determined by this encounter between philosophy and non-philosophy, which is really going to be about how context is going to perpetually intrude on philosophy and how the thinker is going to relate to this incursion. So Harris's defense of philosophy born of struggle reminds us that in giving up, quote, the discovery of absolute truth, objective categories, abstract principles, laws, or pristine methods of reasoning. It is a making that is the hallmark of philosophies. It is the creative process of philosophy, its craft, that is the signature of philosophy. And I'll now turn to Deleuze and Guattari to unpack this making and the role of non-philosophy, which for these authors, right, quote, is perhaps closer to the heart of philosophy than philosophy itself, end quote. For Deleuze and Guattari, philosophical craft includes three moments: the creation of a concept, the instituting of a plane, the invention of a conceptual persona. They're co-constitutive but incommensurable. They implicate and presuppose the others. They delimit and direct the others, right? So I'm gonna kind of take an abridged detour and unpack these terms, specifically looking at how non-philosophy is gonna affect them. So concepts are territories of thinking. They're constellations of singularities which pick out an event from a flow of thinking. And in creating a concept, what the philosopher does is make this kind of thought event reproducible for other people to think about, right? So they give thinking a new place to go. Concepts allow thinking to return, or they would say re-territorialize, on certain events. For example, as Descartes' concept of cogito allows thinking to dwell on that operation of thinking which leads it to posit a self, or as Marx's concept of capitalism allows thinking to grasp the difference between a capitalist and proletariat class. And in this sense, conceptual tools, and here probably I'm echoing Lee's talk earlier, can serve as keys which open onto novel ways of thinking and new strategic horizons. So again, a couple more examples. A concept of child abuse had to be invented in the 20th century for thinking to change its intuitions about parenting. W.E.B. Du Bois' concept of double consciousness brings a specific event of Black experience into relief, which can be taken up by others to make sense of their own life and the world around them. What's at stake in such cases isn't simply a new description of some state of affairs, but the creation of a syndrome that picks out and groups symptoms to render a potential diagnosis of new events. So when concepts link to other concepts, they produce a patchwork image of what it means to think in this way with these concepts. And this image is what Deleuze and Guattari call the plane of immanence. While concepts are created, a plane is instituted by selecting movements that shape an undertow of thinking, the flow of its currents, its tendencies, and its intuitions. If concepts are the skeletal frame, then the plane is the breath that suffuses the separate parts, is what they write. So the plane is like a restless ground of philosophy. It's an exploratory horizon of what they call absolute deterritorialization, this flight. It's this ground for conceptualization itself. It's a shifting noetic landscape that constantly slips outside of its concepts on a flight to the unknown. And this is just to say that the intuitions of thought, be they flights of fancy or brooding spirals, can take philosophy beyond its conceptual territories. And what's important here is that all these intuitions, these movements of thought, are essentially shaped by philosophy's exposure to non-philosophy as a kind of, quote, non-localizable interference distributed across the plane of immanence. So this makes philosophy's deterritorializing ground of the plane pre-philosophical in at least two ways. So first, the plane is presupposed by the concept. It is sort of the non-conceptual milieu that you get the concept out of. Right? But also, secondly, the plane as itself is laid out by selecting flows of thinking out of chaos. The problems for which concepts are the solutions are not themselves just posed by a given plane. Right? Philosophical thinking relies on the plane for its conceptualization, but the intensive features which actually occupy the plane are shaped by its relation to non-philosophy. So by instituting a plane, philosophy gives consistency to chaos. And when it does this, it encounters non-philosophy as the necessary condition for the determination of a pre-philosophical intuition, which itself is the basis for the philosophical extraction of singularities, from this pre-philosophical flow. Okay, it's a mouthful, but in a simplified way, non-philosophy shapes the pre-philosophical flow of thinking with which philosophers are working. Right? So by non-philosophy here, I just mean anything that's not philosophy. It's necessarily ambiguous. Art and science are two non-philosophical activities, which Deleuze and Guattari, of course, discuss, and they discuss in What is Philosophy how both of these interfere in various ways on the pre-philosophical plane. But non-philosophy, I don't think, should be limited to just these either, right? Engineering and math, architecture, theology, debauchery, delinquency, literature, poetry, rhetoric, history, etc., etc. These can all be kind of found lodged on the plane as a mixture of chaos that finds consistency as the ground for a concept. So to say philosophy is always in relation to non-philosophy is different than saying that philosophy can be about anything or of anything, right? It's not about applying philosophical rigor to cases so much as understanding how cases themselves seep into and transform the practice of philosophy from the ground up. So the point is that philosophy is saturated with non-philosophical attitudes and characteristics which permeate the pre-philosophical plane and radically alter the problematic field, how the problem is shaped, out of which concepts are born. Philosophy is always informed by the contingency of geography and the social field from which it sets out. So the point at which philosophy relates to this context shapes the kind of concepts it creates and the intuitions it produces, ultimately underwriting its techniques and methods even when these become incredibly abstract. So the selection of the plane itself presupposes philosophy's third moment, which is the persona. The invention of a persona as the character of a thinker. The role of the persona is to, quote, show thought's territories, its absolute deterritorizations, where it can go beyond the concept, and its reterritorizations, how it comes back to the concept. It's the persona which takes a perspective on the plane in relation to the concepts that it connects. It makes the problem appear on the plane, and it gives intuition a specific character. On the one hand, the persona is the one who sort of guides the plunge into chaos, determining the landscape of the plane itself, directing the ordeal of the encounter with chaos that provokes us to think. But on the other hand, the persona coordinates the movements of the plane with the ordinates of the concept, thereby insisting on a specific enunciation of the conceptualized event. The difference between struggle philosophy and the traditions that it rejects is that they express different ways that non-philosophy, guided by a conceptual persona, interrupt philosophy by introducing a relative context into thinking. There is, for example, a persona which gives the concept of insurrectionist ethics a specific point of view on its particular problematic field, the thinker as abolitionist or maroon, who on the one hand lays out an insurrectionist image of what it means to think by grappling with the irrational and the mad, insofar as the decision to insurrect is never rationally warranted, and who on the other hand coordinates these intuitions with concepts to extend an insurrectionist way of thinking. So it is a persona which coordinates a connective bridge between the concept of oppression and a concept of revolt. It's a different persona entirely which takes the concept of revolt and antipathetically links it to the prosperity of the state through a delirious plunge into paranoia. And what's important here is that the conceptual persona introduce all these personalistic features into concepts, and all such features are shaped, of course, by their epoch or historical milieu, quote. Through personae, concepts obtain specific pathologies, affectations, and alliances. Their characteristics reveal juridical inclinations, and their dynamisms demonstrate possibilities of existence. What these personae draw from their relative milieu are the various characteristics of psychosocial types, which persist within these tangled territories of the social. And here, psychosocial types are historical kinds, right, that demarcate what Deleuze would call the assemblage, right, but they demarcate the territories of the social, how the territory comes back to itself, how it's always flying outside of itself, this deterritorization. Conceptual personae may adopt features from these kinds, but the personae are not themselves the psychosocial types, right? Because the personae could be gross caricatures of a psychosocial type. They could be hybrids of various types, which sort of agglomerate features. But in either case, the personae, what they do is they raise these dynamic features of a psychosocial type out of the relative social field and into this, what they call unhistorical vapor of becoming, to prepare new paths that thinking can go and to reveal different, quote, imminent modes of existence. Conceptual personae are the interface between the absolute deterritorization of the plane and the relative deterritorization of the social field. By plunging into chaos through non-philosophy, conceptual personae guide the ordeal, again, of how philosophy transforms and is in turn transformed by its relative context. So as far as philosophy is concerned, this encounter is purely a throw of the dice. But from the vantage of non-philosophy, this is not a chance meeting, but a strategic bid whose dice rolls are assessed and deliberated on from the characteristic perspectives of relative types of social positions. Quote, philosophy needs a non-philosophy that comprehends it, end quote. Through this comprehension introduced by the persona, this is what I'm going to call its non-philosophical strategy, philosophy attains a peculiar style, the, quote, philosophical gobbledygook that is like the hallmark or strangeness of the philosopher. It is style that constitutes the signature of the making that expresses the specific embedding of non-philosophy within philosophical craft. And while it is true that such gobbledygook can, in the worst cases, become jargon, it can slide into nonsensical and stuffy esotericism, it can take on wildly elusive abstract forms, but in the best cases, perhaps, it can be like the invention of a trade language that joins families of planes, groups of concepts, and types of personae. And of course, it has to be granted that to invoke a best and a worst here, if we say jargon bad and trade language good, we're already relying on some sort of non-philosophical comprehension. And this is precisely the point. What makes philosophy born of struggle unique is not its philosophical armature, but its non-philosophical strategy, which becomes explicit in Harris's normative claim about what philosophy should be or should do. It is this non-philosophical strategy which makes philosophy born of struggle a kind of spiritualization of philosophy rather than a reinvention, redefinition, or reauthorization of a noun thing philosophy. Spiritualization is a word I'm getting from Nietzsche, although to give total credit, I actually picked it up from Yu Kuei, who picked it up from Nietzsche. But in his Will to Power notes, Nietzsche writes that he longs for, quote, an ever greater spiritualization and augmentation of the senses. Yes, he says, we ought to be grateful to our senses for their subtlety, fullness, and force, and we ought to offer them in return the very best of spirit we possess. Spiritualization is an augmentation of sensibility according to spirit. And at the risk of opening Pandora's box, I'll hastily suggest we take spirit to mean something like a historical psychosocial type, or configuration of the trans individual, relative, of course, to a social field. So the spiritualization of philosophy augments philosophical sensibility through the importing of a certain non-philosophically informed style. So through conceptual personae, the authors of philosophy adopt spirits from the psychosocial types they raise to the level of concept creation. To say that philosophical sensibility can be augmented is to say that its philosophical taste, the way they talk about this is as a faculty of co-adaptation, or its love as the well-made concept. Philosophical taste is like the passion to do philosophy, what's going to just keep producing more and more philosophy. This sort of line of philosophical taste, through the augmentation of philosophical sensibility, is stylized. So you have a stylized taste. Right? The spiritualization of philosophy is the production of diverse genres of philosophies, which share a non-philosophical strategy that modulates a shared sensibility. This is evinced, of course, in the use of, for example, poetics or necrodepictions, right, that are included in philosophy's born of struggle. So as Harris is going to emphasize, quote, there is no one philosophy born of struggle. Philosophies arguably weld in a form of philosophy born of struggle speak with unique voices, not with one voice, picture of reality, or standpoint from one set of moral emotions. Philosophy born of struggle is not one philosophical orientation that portends to voice, see, express, and encompass, end quote. Struggle philosophy tends toward the multiplication of orientations. It affirms the difference or discrepancy between orientations while nevertheless investing them with a philosophical sensibility that carries the spirit of organism striving across multiple intersecting planes, personae, and concepts. So I contend that public philosophy is a philosophical activity that advances or contributes to the creation of a new public, in the sense that we were just talking about the creation of a new people, right? Or a new earth, too, as they will say. Philosophical constructions can change their relative milieu. They can find homes in institutions and spark paths in new directions. Since philosophy always relates to non-philosophy, philosophy has always been spiritualized, but it bends toward public philosophy to the degree that it makes this relation and the spiritualization explicit, which is to say, to the degree that non-philosophical strategies modulate philosophical taste. The form of this modulation can be, of course, wildly diverse. it can make use of monsters. And indeed, public philosophy remains intrinsically ambiguous until it takes its non-philosophical strategy. Philosophical taste unto itself cannot say where philosophy ought to go, only where it can go. And the freedom of philosophy pursued by philosophical taste and its love for the well-made concept, this being the very revolutionary potential of philosophy insofar as it pursues absolute deterritorialization. This freedom of philosophy is, at the same time, it's apathy. Concepts don't give a damn about immiseration. Right? And this is to also affirm, in a sense, right, Harris's critique. But to affirm Deleuze-Guattari here, they can be made to. Right? They can be made to care. So concluding, the spiritualization of philosophy wrestles with the apathy of philosophy. It forces philosophy to think non-philosophically about its strategy in relation to specific geographic and socio-political contingencies. It forces the thinker to grapple with all those non-philosophical passions which work their way into philosophical taste, quote, at every moment of its becoming. If philosophy is a walkway, then its craft searches for a way through. But it is non-philosophy which must decide to take this path and guide philosophy every step of the way. Thank you.
Let me ask a question, if I may. You said the concept of non-philosophy has remained vague. But clearly, would you agree with this? Theology and religion would not account for that.
For the vagueness of...
No, it would not count as non-philosophy.
I think they... You say
transcendence, realm transcendence. And...
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah. I think monsters can be non-philosophical. Yeah.
But transcendence is not about monsters. Transcendence is about something outside of immanence. And religion and theology are all about what's outside of immanence.
Yeah, I mean, isn't it the case, right, that like, I could be wrong, right, but like to sort of depict something transcendent, even if, in its illusory way, right, you maybe make use of art or representations. So I think to the extent that art is going to interfere, it's going to introduce figures that could be transcendent. And so, yeah, I think art is definitely going to shape the contours of the plane of eminence, right? And to that extent, yeah. So I don't want to oppose, like, maybe philosophy is, well, okay, never mind, stop. Sorry.
It's okay with me if you oppose religion and transcendence. It's okay with me. The other thing I was going to say is common sense could not count as non-philosophy, given all the critiques that Deleuze has of common sense early in his career. And I bring that up now because you know that common sense has become a kind of catchword for the Trump administration. We're acting on common sense, but all the evils about common sense that Deleuze points out in 1968 are now clearly evident in what's going on in American politics. Hierarchical exclusion, all these things. So that couldn't, even if you talk to somebody on the street, they say, "Oh, you're doing philosophy." I'm a common sense kind of guy, So that wouldn't count as non-philosophy, would it? I mean, you'd have to exclude that as well.
So I think what's interesting here, and what I kind of like about Deleuze-Guattari's picture of philosophy, is there's a certain sense in which it's like radically democratic. Like anybody, anywhere can be philosophical. Like insofar as you're like trying to create concepts, and maybe you have really bad philosophical taste and you do a really poor job of it, right? But to say that that philosophy is always in relation to non-philosophy, like I don't want to be like, well, that's philosophy and that's non-philosophy, right? Like let's take Deleuze-Guattari seriously and just say, philosophy is only this kind of creating with concepts, which implicates this, the plane of the persona and such, right? But anybody can do that, and when they do that, they're always going to be pulling in all sorts of passions and forces and contingencies, right, into that process. And maybe they're a better philosopher, maybe they're not, right? But I don't think it's necessarily the case that non-philosophy is going to make them a better philosopher either way.
So I wonder how, I guess I was waiting to hear, was hoping to hear how far this spiritualization goes in terms of philosophy born of struggle, in terms of struggle philosophy, in the sense of, and it has a lot to do with that term that he kept repeating, right? Non-philosophy, right? And a lot of this argument hinges on that. And because I mean, Dr. Harris's work, I mean, it spans many decades, and he touches on a lot of topics, but he does tackle what you call non-philosophy right now. I think I've termed meta-philosophy at some points when I've written, and what I'm trying to get at is the explicit ways in how it is that we categorize that, and what makes it into strict philosophical terminology or dogma is pretty interesting, and something that I think requires to be more explicit, because Dr. Harris has a lot of critiques of essentialism, for example. I'm thinking of Dignity and Subjection, where he explicitly tackles the essentialism of dignity and says, well, it can't be this essentialist concept. And that's repeated throughout his work, right? Also, racism is not an essentialism. So a lot hinges on that division of philosophy and non-philosophy, and then we can properly get to the spiritualization or the meta-philosophy.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess I would say I'm not really thinking of it like something meta, right? I'm just thinking of it as something more like philosophy is always getting bombarded by sort of like you're in the kind of chaotic situation, right? There's all these sort of contingencies that are coming into the craft of philosophy that you don't really anticipate, and that shape how philosophy as a practice kind of unfolds, right? Now, like, your question though is also kind of about like the demarcate. How do we decide upon, right, philosophy versus non-philosophy? And I think one of the advantages of saying that, look, we're not going to start philosophy.
It's a hard question, by the way. I mean,
yeah, no, and I don't think I have a straight answer for you. Like, but what I'll say is that, like, I think one of the advantages of saying that, you know, what brings all these different orientations of philosophy, point, and struggle together is non-philosophical, is to say, like, look, we can have radically different philosophical disagreements. We can be really hardly philosophically disagreeing, but also strategically on the same page as to sort of what maybe the political project is, maybe the ethical project, whatever, right? Like, I think the strategy here, because that for me was sort of the word that needed to be unpacked more than non-philosophy. Is like, how does strategy kind of get unpacked? But here I think that has to do with some sort of decision about how we relate to our trans-individual relations, right? How we relate to our psychosocial milieu, right?
I had the same question, I think, but I want to offer this up as a potential response and see what you think. So, are you thinking of philosophy proper as conventional philosophy, or philosophy that is accepted by the academy, versus non-philosophy being the stuff that's at the margins?
Okay, so I would say what I don't want to do is like distinguish philosophy from sophistry on the basis of philosophy and non-philosophy, or be like, right? So maybe, and I'm not about to say, well, you know, these people have all been doing philosophy and these people have all not been doing philosophy either. Like, I think
it could just be more about like who's actually awarded and seen as philosophers by the conventional society, versus those who are seen as, I don't know what they're doing by the society, right?
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's what you're doing, or
I'm less interested in that question, right? Okay. I'm less interested in, like, well, who gets to be called a philosopher, or who is, and that may be important, but that's, I guess, not what I'm thinking about here.
Okay.
Because I'm thinking of philosophy as a never mind. Yeah. Okay. No, it's a good question. Yeah.
I'm just like a slightly different kind of question. I'm just curious how you would characterize Harris's style.
Great question. I think it's a sensibility that starts with a recognition of corporeal suffering in the body and the importance of health. And like, there's the line that like I always think of, which is that the precondition for thought is health, right? Has something to do with that. I think there's also sort of there is this kind of sense of universal human liberation there. Even if I think Harris would reject there's like one path to universal human liberation, like I think your non-philosophical strategy is going to be a bit of an amalgamation in any sense, right? That's gonna, in terms of like talking about which planes get joined, which concepts get grouped and stuff, it's gonna take off in lots of different directions, right? But if there's a guiding sensibility, maybe it's something.
And I just want to quickly add, I like the overall structure of the argument, but yeah, I think that it hinges a lot on the strict definitions of philosophy. But I do like the idea of going toward a kind of spiritualization, but that's not, I worry that philosophy born of struggle will get categorized strictly as that, and I think it's also strictly philosophy.
Maybe to frame this better, to say, firstly, this talk was sort of taken from a paper which I wrote just for Deleuzians about what public philosophy means given Deleuze's definition of philosophy. So there's a sense in which I'm saying, okay, here's philosophy born of struggle, how would a Deleuzian explain this? That's it, right? Given this definition of philosophy. So it's like almost, yeah, I haven't defended Deleuze's definition of philosophy, I think. I've kind of assumed it.
But would because I think what I understood, I mean, for instance, for me, and I completely actually, I really enjoyed your paper and I completely agree with it. But I sort of, in terms of, you were talking about like the non-philosophical as being, if I understood correctly, actually the orientation that determines the choices that philosophy makes if it has a commitment to the non-philosophical. So from that point of view, for instance, I understand the decision to depict rather than to explain to be a choice that is based on a commitment to the non-philosophical. We can explain all we want, but actually, in order to act, the depiction does more. So would that be
I would agree with that.
an application of the choice?
I kind of think of like, think of Jacobi's piece on necrodepictions as motivators, right? Rather than an explanation of something, which is going to always require one mode of motivation, whereas depictions are a bit more amorphous, can motivate in lots of different ways.
But to depict or to explain would be a philosophical choice, almost.
I agree.
Okay, yeah, so, okay.